Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to our channel. Dear viewers, there are moments in history when war doesn't arrive with the roar of bombers or the flash of artillery, but in silence. A cold, calculated silence, where shadows of power move behind the curtains of international politics. And sometimes, that very silence can be more dangerous than any gunfire. The confrontation between the United States and Venezuela during Donald Trump's presidency is a prime example. An undeclared war, without open fire or smoke, yet carrying all the traits of a full-scale conflict. Hook, have you ever wondered why a superpower like the United States would go all in on a South American country thousands of kilometers away, to the point of deploying the CIA, aircraft carriers, special forces, psychological warfare, and attack plans never before revealed? The answer, dear friends, doesn't lie on the surface of the events. It runs deeper, in the layers of strategy that only when pieced together reveal the full picture of a power game played in times of so-called peace. Under Trump, everything was pushed to a boldness rarely seen. When the President of the United States himself admitted to authorizing the CIA to carry out lethal operations in Venezuela, when the USS Gerald R. Ford, the very symbol of American military might, appeared just off the Caribbean coast, when tens of thousands of troops were deployed just a few hours' flight from Caracas, then war was no longer an abstract concept. It had already begun, quietly yet fiercely, with a goal not of flattening cities, but toppling a government, seizing control of vast natural resources, and reshaping an entire geopolitical region. What we see in the media is merely the tip of the iceberg. The submerged part, where real plans are executed, is what truly shakes the world. Trump didn't just want to apply pressure, he wanted to win. And to win, Washington was willing to use every tool at its disposal: sanctions, psychological warfare, covert operations, and even high-risk military scenarios. But dear viewers, no war is ever fought without reason. No superpower commits its resources in the name of democracy or human rights alone. Behind every confrontation, there is always a core motive. And in Venezuela's case, that motive is resources. If we want to understand why Washington was willing to push an entire region to the brink of conflict, we must start at the root of all ambition: what lies beneath the ground of Venezuela. Ladies and gentlemen, if we want to understand why Washington was willing to unleash an entire machine of power to pressure Venezuela, we must confront a truth that U.S. officials rarely bother to hide. Resources are at the heart of this conflict. Not democracy, not human rights, and certainly not the poetic promises of liberating the Venezuelan people. What drove Donald Trump's America to intervene with such force lies deep underground. In the oil fields, natural gas reserves, and strategic minerals the world so desperately craves. Despite being strangled by sanctions and plagued by instability, Venezuela still holds a treasure no superpower can ignore. It possesses the largest proven oil reserves on the planet, more than even Saudi Arabia or Iran. And it doesn't stop there. Venezuela is also rich in natural gas, gold, coltan, and especially rare minerals that the global tech industry increasingly relies on. At a time when China has seized control of most of the global rare earth supply chain, Venezuela, leaning toward Beijing, would effectively place a portion of the world's future energy supply into the hands of Washington's greatest geopolitical rival. Donald Trump understood that better than anyone. At a campaign rally, he even bluntly told thousands of supporters, "We could have taken all of Venezuela's oil. No sugarcoating, no diplomacy, no disguise." That one sentence, dear viewers, is the essence of this war. Because if Venezuela remains sovereign, if Caracas continues deepening ties with Russia, China, and Iran, then the energy order that Washington has dominated for decades begins to shake. From a strategic standpoint, Venezuela is like a vital zone just a few hours from Florida, a massive reserve of resources within reach, yet beyond American control. And that directly clashes with the ambitions of America First, a modern-day version of the Monroe Doctrine, where Washington believes the entire Western Hemisphere must fall under its influence. This isn't just about political dominance. It's about controlling resources, controlling cash flow, and controlling every factor that could shape the future of American power. That's why, ever since Hugo Chavez nationalized Venezuela's oil industry, relations between the two countries have plunged into an irreparable abyss. To Washington, Venezuela holding onto its own oil was the greatest sin. And to Trump, toppling the Maduro government wasn't merely a political goal, it was a chance to bring Chevron back in, to reclaim oil fields that hold not just economic value, but strategic importance to America's global power. But dear viewers, resources are only the first layer of this war. To seize those resources, Washington first had to weaken Caracas, to keep Venezuela's leaders in a state of fear, confusion, and poor judgment. And that's when another weapon was activated: psychological warfare. Ladies and gentlemen, in every modern confrontation, war no longer begins with the sound of cannons. It begins with confusion. And if there is one thing Donald Trump wielded more skillfully than any military weapon, it was psychological warfare, a weapon that frightens the enemy even before a single American soldier appears. Trump always knew how to plant in Caracas the feeling that Washington could strike at any moment. One day he declared, "There are no plans to attack Venezuela," and the next day he stated, "All options are on the table." This ambiguity was not emotional or impulsive. It was a deliberate strategy designed to make the Maduro government lose its ability to predict, forcing it to remain on constant high alert. Every time the United States deployed an aircraft carrier, B-52 or B-1 bombers, or moved troops into the Caribbean, the message sent to Caracas wasn't just a threat. It was a psychological test. Would Venezuela tremble? Would divisions within the military begin to panic, mistrust one another? Would generals lose confidence in the government's ability to protect the country? Behind the scenes, the CIA carried out a series of covert operations, encouraging defections, sowing division within the military, spreading rumors that the U.S. is about to attack, all to push Venezuela's defense system into a state of prolonged tension. A source once told the New York Times, "The goal of this psychological strategy is to make Maduro live in constant fear." And that, dear viewers, is the true danger of this war. Not missiles, not gunfire, but the erosion of morale from within. Washington understood that an anxious military, a strained government, and a society shaken by rumors would weaken itself without the need for a direct strike. This is the essence of hybrid warfare, where propaganda, disinformation, sanctions, cyber attacks, and military threats blend together, creating a spiral that slowly wears down the opponent. But, ladies and gentlemen, psychological warfare is only the first step. When Washington believed Caracas had weakened enough, another door opened, a door leading to far bolder, far more dangerous plans that blatantly violated international law. That was when top-secret scenarios were put on the table, launching a preemptive strike on Caracas, assassinating the president, kidnapping key leaders, and seizing strategic oil fields at all costs. When psychological warfare had softened the target, when uncertainty had seeped into every layer of Caracas's power structure, Washington moved into a far bolder phase, crafting real, concrete, highly detailed operational plans that could be activated at any moment. And according to investigative reports by the New York Times and multiple intelligence sources, during Donald Trump's tenure, the White House wasn't just theorizing. It prepared a series of potential attack scenarios against Venezuela. Scenarios that, if carried out, could have pushed South American history in an entirely different direction. The first scenario was informally called Shock and Awe 2.0, a modern version of the strategy used in Iraq in 2003. Its objective was to strike directly at Caracas with a wave of rapid air attacks, destroying military command centers, paralyzing air defenses, cutting communication lines between the leadership and the armed forces, and creating chaos in the first hours. In such a situation, Washington calculated that Maduro would be forced to flee his safe location, and that precise moment would be when CIA teams and U.S. Special Forces could strike. But that was only the overwhelming strike scenario. In parallel, another plan was studied even more meticulously, the capture or kill option, modeled after the operation that eliminated Osama bin Laden. According to former U.S. officials, special operations teams would secretly infiltrate Venezuela by sea or air, head straight to Maduro's residence or workplace, neutralize his security detail, and either capture him alive or eliminate him. Some documents even detailed escape routes, entry points, and the coordinated roles of the CIA and internal opposition forces. And if you think that was the peak of boldness, there was an even more crucial plan, the one Trump reportedly took a personal interest in: seizing Venezuela's entire oil and gas infrastructure. From the world's largest oil fields to pipelines, export terminals, and refineries, every part of the system appeared on the list Washington intended to control at any cost. The logic was simple. If you seize the oil, the Venezuelan government loses its only lifeline. The economy collapses, the military loses operational capacity, society plunges into chaos. And at that point, installing a pro-American government becomes only a matter of time. In Washington's calculations, this wasn't a typical regime change attempt. It was American-style nation-building, dismantling the opponent's foundations, seizing resources, and reshaping the entire political structure to suit U.S. interests. And if the plan succeeded, Chevron would be the first corporation invited back to tap into the oil fields the world has long coveted. But, ladies and gentlemen, an intervention of this scale couldn't rely on military or intelligence power alone. Washington needed a third spearhead, a force inside Venezuela that could support, legitimize, or even open the gates for outside intervention. And that force was the far-right opposition faction. Figures trained, sponsored, and directly backed by Washington. At the center of that network stands a name mired in fierce controversy, Maria Corina Machado. For a regime change operation to succeed, Washington understood it couldn't rely solely on military power or covert operations. It needed a long arm inside Venezuela, a political force ambitious enough, aggressive enough, and dependent enough on the U.S. to be ready to replace the legitimate government if the opportunity arose. And among all the opposition figures in Venezuela, no one embodied those traits more clearly than Maria Corina Machado. Machado is not a representative of the poor, nor is she a voice for the working class, the majority of Venezuela's population. She hails from a wealthy, white, Criollo elite family, the kind of oligarchs who once treated Venezuela as their private inheritance, living lavishly between Caracas and Miami, and managing the country as though it were a family business. Before Hugo Chavez came to power, this elite class controlled nearly all of Venezuela's oil wealth, while over half the population lived in poverty. So when Chavez nationalized the oil industry, it wasn't just a policy shift, it was a direct blow to the economic dominance of families like the Machados. Perhaps that's why, for years, Machado has been the face of the far-right opposition, openly calling for the full privatization of Venezuela's oil sector, welcoming Chevron and other American corporations back in, and pledging to remove the influence of China, Russia, and Iran entirely. Her speeches in Miami, Washington, and Brussels aren't just aimed at Venezuelans. They carry a crystal-clear message. She wants to bring Venezuela back under the protective umbrella of the United States. U.S. officials, particularly figures like Marco Rubio, have publicly backed her. American media has portrayed Machado as a beacon of democracy, while many sources suggest she's been heavily financed by lobbying groups in Washington. Even the recent Nobel Peace Prize awarded to her stirred major controversy, with experts arguing it was the result of a carefully orchestrated campaign to legitimize the regime change agenda. But ladies and gentlemen, Machado's role isn't confined to Venezuela's borders. She represents a much larger strategy, one the U.S. has used since the Cold War, installing a pro-American opposition, creating the appearance of a grassroots democratic movement, and using it to justify foreign intervention. And this is where Venezuela's story spills beyond the limits of any single country. It touches broader corridors of global power, where major players like China, Russia, and Iran are deeply involved. Venezuela is no longer just a target. It has become a flashpoint in a global power struggle. When we look deeper into the geopolitical landscape surrounding Venezuela, we realize this confrontation is not merely a matter between Washington and Caracas. Behind it lies a much larger, more intense struggle, one where four global powers collide head-on: the United States, China, Russia, and Iran. In a sense, Venezuela has become a 21st century proxy battleground, a place where the shifting world order is being tested through oil, sanctions, diplomacy, and covert operations. Today's Venezuela is no longer the isolated nation once bullied by a superpower, as it was in decades past. Russia now serves as its military backbone, providing advisors, training, and air defense systems. China is Venezuela's largest economic partner, a vital creditor, and an infrastructure powerhouse that Caracas can't easily replace. Iran, meanwhile, has become the savior of Venezuela's oil refining sector, sending technology, specialists, and even fuel during the toughest moments of U.S. sanctions. Together, these alliances form what could be called a multipolar shield, making any attempt by Washington to orchestrate regime change far more complicated than ever before. A strike against Venezuela is no longer just a strike on a South American nation. It risks impacting the interests of Moscow, Beijing, and Tehran. And under Donald Trump, Washington understood this well. But instead of backing down, the U.S. saw it as even more reason to double down. Because if Venezuela holds firm, if Caracas becomes a pillar for a multipolar order in the Western Hemisphere, then American influence in the region could dissolve like foam on water. Just imagine, ladies and gentlemen, if Venezuela maintains its network of ties with China, Russia, and Iran, the United States would fail in its efforts to isolate Cuba, to contain Nicaragua, and to control South America. A goal Washington has pursued since the Monroe Doctrine over 200 years ago. On the other hand, if the U.S. succeeds in Venezuela, it would reassert dominance over the Western Hemisphere, push Russia and China out of what was once considered its historic backyard, and gain control of one of the largest oil reserves on Earth. And that is why this war is no longer just Venezuela's story. It has become a new flashpoint in the global confrontation between two competing models of world order, one led by US-dominated unipolarity, the other by a rising multipolarity emerging from Eurasia. The conflict in Venezuela, when all is said and done, is a microcosm of today's world, a world where power is no longer measured solely by aircraft carriers, but by the silent alliances shaping the future of humanity. Ladies and gentlemen, as we close this sweeping and complex picture we've just journeyed through, we come to realize that the war the United States is waging against Venezuela is not merely a test of power or a simple fight over resources. It is a battle that represents the 21st century itself, an era where the lines between peace and conflict are increasingly blurred, where war is no longer defined by tanks and missiles, but by a fusion of information, psychology, economics, diplomacy, and shadowy alliances behind the scenes. For Washington, Venezuela is a crucial link in its effort to preserve the unipolar world order it has dominated for decades. An independent, self-determined Venezuela with strong ties to Russia, China, and Iran is simply unacceptable within America's strategic vision. But for Caracas, this isn't just about sovereignty. It is a fight to protect the right of an entire people to determine their own future. A battle not to become a pawn on the chessboard of great powers. So, who will win and who will lose in this confrontation? There's no easy answer. The U.S. holds the advantage in military strength, media influence, and economic reach. But Venezuela holds its own geographic leverage, abundant natural resources, and perhaps most importantly, the backing of global powers that are challenging the old order. This is a war that, if it reaches a conclusion, won't be decided by a single battle, but by the shifting tides of the world itself, whether the future belongs to one dominant superpower or to a multipolar system where many nations have an equal voice. And above all, dear viewers, Venezuela is only the beginning. What's happening here will shape how great powers intervene or fail to intervene in other nations for decades to come. It's a stark reminder that we are entering an era where every move counts. And every small conflict could be a piece of a much larger puzzle. What do you think about this silent war? Could this be the opening act of a new era of confrontation in the Western Hemisphere? Leave your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel to stay with us for the most in-depth and up-to-date geopolitical analysis.